Hi, this is Synthchaser from Synthchaser.com. In the last 5 videos I showed you the inner workings of the ARP Quadra and a bit of what was involved in restoring and repairing one. Now that the synthesizer is complete, I thought I'd make a brief video demonstrating the features and sounds of the ARP Quadra. Please bear in mind that I'm an engineer and not a musician, so nothing I do in this video is any attempt at being musical, just giving you an idea of the features and the sound. We'll start over here with the bass synthesizer. There are 2 registers of electric bass, which is similar to the bass used in the ARP Omni 2, and there's 2 registers of string bass, which is also similar to the string bass used in the ARP Omni 2. To engage these sounds, just press the touch panel and make sure the instrument is turned up in the mix. For electric bass, you'll go through the bass mixer, and for string bass, you'll go through the strings mixer. The bass sounds work over the lowest 2 octaves of the keyboard. Here's the 16-foot electric bass sound. And here's the 8-foot electric bass sound. You can transpose the bass down an octave, so you can get sounds as low as this, into the clicking range. You can stack the bass sounds. You can detune the bass. And there are a couple parameters of the electric bass that you can play with. You can set the decay time to be shorter. Right now it's set to the longest possible decay time. And we can reduce that. And this is the shortest. There's also a resonance control. You've been hearing it so far without resonance. But we can add resonance in. And that gives us a funkier tone. To hear the string bass registers, we have to turn strings up in the mix and then select one of the registers here. This is the 8-foot string bass, and it operates over the lowest 2 octaves of the keyboard. And this is the 16-foot string bass. Just like in the ARP Omni 2, the bass synthesizer, both string and electric bass, is monophonic and has low note priority. Just like with the electric bass, you can detune the string bass. You can also transpose the string bass. And because the string bass is routed through the string section in the mixer, they give you a separate control here for the string bass volume, so you can control that in the mix separate from any strings that you have in the mix. The next section we'll look at is the polyphonic string synthesizer. The string synthesizer works over the upper 4 octaves of the keyboard. And to engage it, you just select one of the registers of strings. I've selected 4-foot strings, and you make sure strings is turned up in the mix. And that's where it ends. This is 8-foot strings. And you can stack them together and play polyphonically. And the circuitry and sound is nearly identical to the ARP Omni 2. Just like with the ARP Omni, there's attack and release controls, although to turn them on you have to engage the touch panel membrane switch like this. So even though attack is set very high, you can see that it's an immediate attack until I engage this switch. That's a long attack. And similarly with release, we can set the release to as long as possible, but it's still a very short release until we engage the switch. Also, like on the ARP Omni 2, you can modify the sound with a hollow waveform modifier, which basically changes the sawtooth-ish string sounds into a more hollow, squarish sound. So because strings works over the upper 4 octaves and bass works over the lower 2 octaves, there's an octave range here where you can get both bass and strings simultaneously. The next section is the polyphonic synthesizer, the polysynth. The polysynth, when enabled by itself, works over the upper 4 octaves of the keyboard. To get sound out of the polysynth, turn on one of the registers, 4 feet or 8 feet, and turn polysynth up in the mix. Additionally, you'll either need to turn on ADSR or cutoff frequency to get some sound out of it. This is what the 8-foot polysynth sounds like. And the 4-foot polysynth. In order for sound to pass through the polysynth, it has to go through the VCF. So you have to let something through, and you can control what goes through either by a fixed cutoff frequency or using the ADSR. You can modify that with the LFO modifier, which uses the main LFO control here of the synthesizer. So this is without LFO control. Cutoff frequency is about half. You can also allow the resonance slider to affect the sound. There's also a full ADSR here, and in order for these sliders to have any effect, you need to engage the touch panel switch. And it has the same quirk that the ARP Omni 2 has, in that the strings release actually affects the release of the polysynth. So here I have release all the way up and release engaged, ADSR routed to the VCF, but there's no release. So if I turn release on over here and raise the release in the string section, then it gives us our intended function. You can see we can get some nice brassy sounds out of this polysynth. And also the hollow waveform modifier affects the polysynthesizer as well. One nuance that's different with the polysynthesizer from the string synthesizer is that if you engage a bass voice, now polysynthesizer will only work over the upper 3 octaves. So I have only polysynth turned on in the mix, and you see it ends there, where bass would begin. Whereas with strings, over this octave they stacked. That brings us over now to the lead synthesizer, which is a full-featured lead synthesizer with 2 VCOs, a VCF, a VCA, an LFO, and sort of a sample and hold, which we'll get to a little later when we cover the phase shifter. Your ARP Omni 2 never made sounds like that. So let's talk about the oscillators first. So we have 2 oscillators, and I've disabled VCO2. So right now we'll only be hearing VCO1. So this is a typical range with your 5-octave keyboard. From clicks if that isn't a big enough range, you can actually transpose this oscillator using the interval right function. With the interval right feature, you can transpose your VCO by any amount up to 5 volts. So basically, assume that this low key, if this were the lowest note that the oscillator could play, is 0 volts. With our keyboard, with 1 volt per octave, we can get up to 5 volts. Using this interval right, we can select a transposition voltage that we want to add to whatever we play on the keyboard. So we can transpose up 1 octave by hitting interval right and C2. Now what we had before is transposed up an octave. You don't have to transpose by octave. You can transpose by any semitone you can press on the keypad. So we'll transpose by that. And we'll put it back. So in theory, you could get this up to 10 volts maximum control voltage by hitting interval right and hitting the highest C on the keyboard. Now our low C is pretty high. And now it's so high you don't even hear it, but that's ridiculously high. So we're at a 9 octave range. We barely, just before the 10th octave, we stop hearing it. But that is crazy large range. You have your choice of a few waveforms. This affects both VCO1 and VCO2. So we have sawtooth, which was what we've been listening to. Square wave. A narrow square wave, or a pulse wave. And we can add pulse width modulation to that as well. We can add in our second VCO by turning this switch to VCO2 on. And you hear the sound get fatter. You can detune either of the two oscillators using these separate controls. You can also use the keyboard duophonically, like a ARP Odyssey, by hitting 2-voice on. Now, instead of playing those two VCOs in unison, if you gate a second key, it will play that on the second oscillator. To the left of the keybed, you have portamento or glide controls separately over each of the oscillators. And you can use that for some pretty cool sounds. There's also a vibrato, which you engage by pressing this button. So you can control the depth of the vibrato and the speed using the main LFO control. You can also get vibrato effects with the trill oscillator here. So there's a trill button, and before you use that, you need to set up an interval for the trill oscillator to use. So to do that, we're going to hit interval right, we're going to select trill, and we're going to select an offset based on starting here at low C. So if we want to go up 2 notes, we would hit D, and that loads the interval into the trill oscillator. Now we'll engage trill by hitting trill, and when we play a note, you can hear it basically toggling between the 2-note interval that we told it to. You can select the speed, so here's trill with just one of the oscillators turned on. And you can add portamento to make this less of a square wave type of modulation. There's an ADSR for the lead synthesizer as well, so to affect the attack time and release time and decay time, you have to turn these on. There's also a sustain low button. You can hear the volume is softer now than with that off. You can play with the VCF cutoff and resonance. And you can even get the filter to self-oscillate by turning off the cutoff frequency. And you're hearing now a sine wave coming from the filter self-oscillating. Instead of setting a fixed cutoff frequency, you can have the ADSR control opening up and closing up the filter, and you can get pretty cool sounds. And with both oscillators. Finally, there's a couple features down here that affect the lead synthesizer, the touch sensor and the sequencer. So the ARP Quadra has aftertouch over the upper 3 octaves of the keyboard. In fact, for this ARP Quadra, we replaced the touch sensor mechanism because when we were refurbishing it, we tested it and it didn't look good. To engage touch sensor effects, you use this switch here. And you can have the touch sensor affect 2 things, the volume and filter and pitch bend. So for volume and filter, this is with no aftertouch. Of course, it's going to depend on your settings for your filter, what kind of sound that you're going to get out of it. But you can see that you have very broad control there. And there's a little hole in the panel here where you can change the magnitude of the touch sensor effect to get a stronger or weaker effect. We can also use the touch sensor to bend the pitch. And again, you can adjust that trimmer to determine how much the pitch will bend. Finally, we'll get to the sequencer. The sequencer isn't really a sequencer. It's more like an arpeggiator. So to turn it on, you select one of these modes, and you can do it where it arpeggiates up only. And you can do it where it does up and down. This is the mixer that I've been using to turn on and off or mix in the individual sections. We've got the bass, strings, poly, and lead synth sections. There's also a 5th one here for an external audio source. There's a master volume control, and down here are the controls for the phase shifter. So with your ARP Quadra and your ARP Omni, you have strings that sound like this. With the ARP Omni and the ARP Omni 2, you can toggle the chorus phaser button, which sounds absolutely terrible when you run it through their chorus phaser. So with the ARP Quadra, there's a much more powerful phase shifter that sounds like this. And you have control over the sweep speed. And you can also add in resonance. And you can route any combination of the 4 sections through the phase shifter by touching the touch panel buttons. So you have a few modifiers that you can modulate the phase shifter by. With all these turned off, you're modulating with the sweep speed slider here. We can modulate it with an envelope, so here it is without the envelope modulation. and with envelope modulation. We can modulate it by sample and hold, and sample and hold samples from oscillator 2. And the sample rate is set by the LFO. You can also use the pedal as your modulation source. You also have 16-patch program memory, which is of limited value because it doesn't save the value of the sliders. It just saves the interval that you've saved for the transpose of your oscillators and for your trill oscillator. And it saves which buttons you've pressed on the touch panel. So here's program 1 and program 16. And you can just go back and forth between them. It also runs on AA batteries, so the lifespan of your memory retention is pretty short. I programmed in the factory patches from the owner's manual, and I'll show you some of the better ones. Putting it all together, even someone like me can get a really rich sounding analog sound out of this. With its rich sound and set of features, it's easy to see how in the right hands the Quadra has amazing potential. This particular Quadra is on its way off to its new home, where I know it's going to be used to make some awesome music that you're going to hear soon on the radio. I do have 2 more ARP Quadras that I'll be restoring and selling, so if you're interested in picking up an ARP Quadra, drop me a line on my website, Synthchaser.com. I am the Synthchaser, and I thank you for joining me in this video. Please be sure to join me again soon to venture inside other legendary vintage synthesizers.